Confession. As a pastor, I have made some deadly Sunday morning mistakes that have driven away visitors from our church for years, and I'm embarrassed to admit it. In fact, one of them I think caused about 40% of our first-time visitors to not come back again. The good news is I was able to fix most of these. In fact, when I fixed number 5 that I'm gonna share with you, our giving increased by about 23%. These aren't just theories I'm gonna share with you, they're real world blunders that I personally have made, and I'm gonna share them with you in the hopes that you can avoid the same pitfalls that I fell into. Let's do this. Well, hey guys, I'm Thomas here from REACHRIGHT. We put out new content like this every single week, so it would mean a lot to me if you would hit that subscribe button. Now, I've been in ministry since the early 2000s, and in that time, I have held all kinds of roles from executive pastor to lead pastor to associate pastor. I've even worked in denominational leadership, and I've seen just about anything and everything you can imagine in a church context. And with that, I have made plenty of mistakes. In fact, I'm embarrassed to admit some of the things that I used to do that I'll cover in this conversation here. So the first mistake that I corrected about 15 years ago is apologizing for talking about giving. I see so many pastors do this. It typically goes something like this. I want to thank you so much for being here for the first time at our church. And I just want to say, I'm sorry that today, we're actually going to be talking about giving. We don't always talk about giving. It's something we only talk about once in a while, but we are talking about it today. So I hope you come back next week and you can hear a more regular message and not just one about giving. No, stop doing those kinds of things. A pastor friend of mine saw me doing something to this effect when I was welcoming visitors, and he said, Thomas, you have to stop doing that. Never apologize for talking about giving. Why? It's because giving is biblical, and God teaches us about giving not to harm us, but to bless us. We have no business apologizing for things that God says are good. So you should talk about giving with confidence, not in fear that someone might be offended or not want to come back because you're one of those pastors that only cares about money. Put all that stuff aside, stop apologizing for talking about giving, and you'll have a better giving message, and people will respect you for having the courage to talk about a difficult topic. Next up, we have using insider language. And there's the common things you're probably thinking of, like maybe you shouldn't use terms like justification and propitiation in your message, but I'm talking about a much more simple form than that. One of the things that I see so many church leaders doing is using acronyms on Sunday morning that a visitor would be totally unaware of. I used to pastor a church where we had small groups that were called Journey Community Groups, and internally we called them JCGs. And generally speaking, members of our church knew what a JCG is, but you know who didn't know what a JCG was? Yeah, that's right, a first-time guest. They'd have no clue what I meant when I said a JCG. We had to be really intentional not to use JCG when we were giving our announcements or inviting someone to a new group, but actually saying the whole phrase, Journey Community Group. Now, if you feel like it's too long to say those kinds of things every time, well, maybe consider that you haven't named it right. Think about maybe a new name you can give your small groups or some other ministry. One of the places I see this happening most is with Vacation Bible Schools, or VBS. Now, to us in the church world, when I say VBS, we know exactly what we mean by that. But a lot of times someone that's new to church, or specifically someone that's new to faith, they'll have no clue what a VBS is. So being clear and saying Vacation Bible School, and then actually explaining what that is will get you a lot further with someone who probably wants to send their kids to VBS. The next one, and one of the ones that I'm definitely guilty of, is giving vague next steps to people. Every service should have a few next steps and invite people to do something as a result of the time of worship, the announcements, and especially from the sermon. We owe it to ourselves to be ultra clear on exactly what that next step is. But the trap that a lot of pastors fall into is that we feel like maybe we need to take a little bit of pressure off of our listeners by being a little bit more casual with our next steps. And that's a big no-no. You need to make sure that you are super clear with what someone should do in response to your sermon or in response to the announcements and how they can take a next step. Rather than saying something like, get more involved in our church, how about saying something more like, After service, head to our next steps table and connect with one of our connection specialists who will help you take that next step to get more involved in our church. You see what I did there? There's no mistaking what getting more involved in our church would look like. Their next step is very clear, very specific, and there's no confusion to be had. Another mistake I see in the same vein is giving people lots of options on how to take the same step. For instance, when you're collecting a visitor's information, maybe you have that in a digital form as well as a physical form. And what I find is that if you let people do it on their phones or on paper, all that really does is add confusion. Choose one or the other, and you'll typically get more responses to someone taking a next step. Number 4, and I see this one all the time, is starting your services late. Now, I understand most of our church services, people do not show up right when we want to start. Now, if your church is anything like mine, right when service starts, people tend to start trickling in at that point. But if you take a look at the audience right when worship is supposed to start, sometimes you might be tempted to think, man, let's wait for a few more people to show up and then we can start worship when everybody gets here. This is a bad idea because what it does is it reinforces that showing up late is fine. And when I have tried these kinds of things, what tends to happen is that people wind up showing up later and later. Now, why people are showing up late is the topic for another video that I'm sure we'll do at some point. But what we need to do as leaders of churches now is make sure we start when we say we're going to start. The last thing you want to do is become a church where whatever time you announce something starts is always way earlier than when it actually starts. Once we get into that mode, it really gets hard to change course back and right the ships. And believe me, I've been there where the worship team is bigger than the number of people that are sitting in the chairs, but you have to start that way anyway. And over time, this tends to solve itself, especially if we are consistent and start on time. Before we go any further, I want to mention a totally free resource that your church should definitely take advantage of. Here at REACHRIGHT, we put together free online strategy reviews where our team will take a deep dive into your overall digital presence and give you a score, 1 out of 100, to see where you stand exactly in your current digital presence. We'll send that over to you and even give you some marching orders on how your church can make some improvements. I'll leave a link to it down in the description. Make sure you sign up and take advantage of that today. Here's the 5th thing you need to stop doing in your Sunday services is taking scripture totally out of context. I know it because I've done it. It's reading a scripture because it makes a point and it really seems to align well with what you want to say on a Sunday morning, but in reality, it meant something totally different to the original authors. The one that comes to mind to me every time when I think about this is Jeremiah 29:11. You all know it. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. How powerful and meaningful, but we forget this is not delivered to people that are like us living in the 21st century, but it was given to people that were just taken into captivity from Israel to Babylon and were about to remain there for the next 70 years. Yeah, that's a promise that maybe meant a little bit something different to the original hearers than it does to our audience here today. And please hear me, I say this not out of judgment, but out of someone who's made these kinds of mistakes before. It's important that we give context for every scripture that we're reading, especially the main passage that we're preaching from. A lot of pastors, I think, fear that their people in their church aren't ready for some of these deep or harder to hear truths from scripture or the context around some of these stories. But in my experience, people in your church will love to hear some of the context around why these stories were told the way they were or why these laws were given in the way that they were. This kind of stuff interests people, and I think it actually makes your sermons more impactful. Number 6, and I bet you probably do this one, is skipping personal introductions. This may seem out of left field to you, but you have to remember when there's a visitor at your church, chances are they don't know who you are. You get up there on stage and you start delivering your sermon and they don't know if you're a visiting pastor, the lead pastor, or someone who's just giving the message for the first time. We have a rule at my church that anybody that gets on stage, part of what they need to do is introduce themselves. So our worship leaders introduce themselves before the worship set starts, our announcement people introduce themselves, and our main speaker, even if it's the lead pastor who everybody who's not a first-time visitor already knows who they are, we make sure that everybody gives a proper introduction introduction. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It's just, hey, my name's Thomas. I'm one of the pastors here. Or hi, I'm John. I'm one of the elders. These kinds of simple introductions just give people some context and help them know who they're dealing with and who they're listening to. Now, this last one, and I have to admit, it's one that I took years to put into practice, but when I made this change, it totally changed everything for me, is neglecting sermon practice. For years, I would write out some kind of an outline for my message, but the first time I would deliver it would be right there in our services. I changed all this a few years ago to where I practice at least once through every single message that I ever preach. And it's actually pretty embarrassing. If you were to watch me do a practice, you would probably be laughing at me. I tell jokes and then I laugh at my own jokes just like that. I'll ask questions and I'll pretend to get responses from the audience. I go through the whole process of exactly what I would want to preach on Sunday morning, but I do that typically on Friday afternoon when I'm preparing. What this does is it helps me really work out some of those kinks. I find that typically it's those transitions where I tend to mess up the most. So making sure that I have a good plan on how to transition from introduction to main body, how to change from point to point to point, having all of those things dialed in really does help me. In fact, I actually just did a video where I broke down the exact way that I recommend you write a sermon. And part of that process is practicing, but before you get to practicing, you need to know how to write a sermon. Let me give you my exact prescription on how to do that.